Ladies and gentlemen, please get seated. We are going to start a fantastic session. The DPI approach to digital identity and digital development. Actually, I would like to ask the panelists to join me on the stage, the first segment, S1. While they're up on the stage, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. I'd like to ask Robert Upp, the Chief Digital Officer, UNDP, please on the stage. Dr. Kanwal Singh, the Senior Program Officer, DPI, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Nanjira Sambuli, Fellow from the Technology and International Affairs Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As our distinguished panelists make it to the stage, I'd like to ask everyone to take your seat as soon as you can so we can start on time. Before we start, I would like to say and do a shout out to members of parliament. I've been enjoying meeting with you and hearing from you. It's been not only a full day, but you have been wonderful. So please, give me a round of applause to the members of parliament who took the time to be here. Thank you. And members of parliament, please stay in this room at the end of this session for what you have requested, a family photo. So we will have all the flags of your country, and we will have a family photo with all of you. So please stay here at the end of this session. So thank you for being with us. Now, I would like to just let the room quiet down a little bit. As you know, this session is going to be divided into 3 segments. The first segment is a policy session. Unfortunately, the minister from Madagascar was held back for official business and could not be with us. Nevertheless, that means that will give us a little bit more time to go deeper into the discussion with our illustrious panel members. And so, as we had done also in prior sessions, Slido will be open. So basically, please use Slido. I will monitor Slido to see and try to engage you with the panel. But the first thing I want to start with, and perhaps I will direct that question to Robert Upp. In our theme, we say digital identity as DPI. So the question I have for Robert, in the most simple term, what do you consider as DPI? Have you heard throughout the morning about DPI? And if so, what do you think was a DPI, or what do you think is a DPI?
Okay. All right, is this on? Okay, good. Well, first, thank you, Joseph, for the invitation to be on this panel, and greetings to everyone. When we talk about digital public infrastructure, it is really talking about, that phrase is something that a lot of countries have been working on already for a number of years. But what we've been trying to introduce, we, UNDP, but with many partners in this kind of broader ecosystem, we've been really looking at the interaction of different technologies with each other in interoperable ways for public benefit. Now, the easiest way that I would try to explain what digital public infrastructure is, what we consider to be digital public infrastructure, is if you consider that the role of physical infrastructure, that if you're building roads and bridges, those are pieces of physical infrastructure that are initiated by governmental bodies, that are planned out, that are sometimes built by private sector or others, but what are they there for? They're for the usage of individuals, of businesses, of government itself to deliver services, and so on and so forth. So in the digital space, when we talk about digital public infrastructure, it's the digital equivalent of that. In other words, what are the railways, the bridges, the roads that are in the digital space that can be made available, can be used to deliver digital public services, can be used to build businesses on, can be used to get data from and use for different purposes and so on. So digital identity, which is really, you know, the reason for being for this meeting, is one of those core pieces that we consider to be a potential part of digital public infrastructure. And digital identity is probably, in many ways, one of the most core pieces because it interlinks with so many other kinds of pieces of technology that can be out there. So, the digital public infrastructure, the digital equivalent of roads and bridges, the aspects that we feel set it apart: interoperability, governance around it, in other words, the safeguards and protections, and the ability to interact with communities. So innovation, business communities, others can kind of build on top of it. Those would be the fundamental characteristics that we put forward.
Let's park that for a second. That's a good definition, good description. I want to go to Kanwal. Kanwal, when we look at the physical analog of a digital public infrastructure, the most critical element of that seems to be sort of the governance aspect, which allows basically different entities not to claim ownership, but to share. Can you elaborate on how you see the role of governance in defining digital public infrastructure? Is governance an afterthought that we put in there, or is it actually fundamental to the definition of a digital public infrastructure? How do you see governance?
Thank you, Joseph. The easy answer to your question, Joseph, is that governance lies at the core of what DPI is. As Robert mentioned in the definition of DPI, we talked about interoperability, we talked about safeguards, we talked about reuse, but we have a much more familiar example, and I'm going to mention the example and then move into its governance to see how that has impacted. DPI is not a new idea. I think it's a rediscovered idea. If we look around the room, almost everybody here has a smartphone. It might have been manufactured by a company called Apple or Samsung or one of the other ones. It might be running an operating system that it could be iOS, Android, many of the other ones. You might be communicating with your family and friends using WhatsApp, Signal, Discord, or any of the other apps. You might be on a provider network, which could be different from almost everyone in the room. You might be communicating to any country, anywhere in the world. And how is this enabled? This is enabled by the 3 original DPIs. Those are GPS, those are mobile communications, and those are the internet. Now, if we look at the governance of these 3 DPIs, the original DPIs, they're very different. How internet standards evolved, how mobile standard evolved, how GPS evolved in providing latitude and longitude information as a public good. All 3 have very unique governance structures, but one common thread between those is ensuring that the whole system connects to each other with full interoperability. There is no dependency of system, there is no dependency of application. So that's one piece. Second is allowing the ecosystem to innovate. I often joke that when the GPS was first envisioned, nobody was thinking about Uber or one of the many food delivery apps. The ecosystem learned how to innovate on top of a DPI. And I think the governance structure that preserves these properties of a DPI, which are interoperability and allowing the ecosystem to innovate and improve it to get high volumes, that's what really generates the value proposition. We saw this morning in many presentations from many countries where they said ID is at the core of our digital infrastructure, and it is used from use cases as varied as opening a bank account, getting a SIM card, figuring out if the right student is giving the right exam, figuring out if a credential belongs to the right one. So I think governance is at the core of it because that's where the public interest comes from. Otherwise, it's very simple. In the private sector, there also innovation happens, but the drivers are different, and it is usually not full population scale in the public interest.
Let me follow up, because you mentioned examples that will help us clarify an important point, is that often people think DPIs, digital public infrastructure, are actually built and owned by the government, but all the examples that you have highlighted are not.
Absolutely not. In fact, they don't have to be. In fact, the private sector can also provide DPIs.
Exactly.
Right? So I think that's a misconception. If we were to look at the properties of a DPI, for me, a more important distinction is if I look at something, can I tell that it's not a DPI? I think the negative counterfactual test is more important for me. And so the DPI, nowhere does it say that it has to be owned by the government, operated by the government, regulated by the government. I think the core properties of DPI are ecosystem innovation and public interest, shared, minimalistic building block.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're starting to understand a little bit better that these are shared assets, meaning they are not shared by bilateral agreements, but they are shared in a manner that allows different parties playing within the governance framework to participate and to be able to use them without being told, no, you cannot do that. So we are all free to use the GSM network, etc., because actually there is a financial incentive to do that. Digital public infrastructure does not mean that there is no economic model behind them. Let's park that question. That's a very enriching perspective, Kanwal. Thank you for that. I want to go to Nanjira. And Nanjira, as these two gentlemen have just said, these what we call digital public infrastructure is nothing new, right? It's digitalization. It's a change in thinking. But it seems to be bringing up a certain reaction of fear. Why are these DPIs all of a sudden becoming a focal attention of concern and risk? What do you see the problem?
In part, it's the continual attempt to understand the definition. The quest for a definition remains elusive. And I think there's valid anxiety, and especially if I may speak to African contexts, of when a new concept comes in, all attention shifts into it. And what has been the slow-paced, incremental work of building the fundamental blocks sometimes is overlooked. And a big risk I think we're seeing in the theater where all these DPIs are being deployed is, does it help address how a government is accountable to its citizens? Do we get more transparency, which is the fundamental things that we keep saying democracy and all the principles of organized society are about? And those questions sometimes are not answered neatly or even at all when we introduce new concepts. So I would wager that the way DPI has entered the discourse has created anxiety because it seems like it's a new terminology. All of us are working our way into understanding, and where this work that has been done over the last 20 or so years, on the continent especially, to get digitalization as an agenda, as a priority, to get governments to work with citizens, and especially through civil society organizations, working with communities on the same table. Does this concept help that get closer, or does it just neatly, again, arrange them in tech stacks? So your point about governance was really interesting because I think at the end of the day, there's also the layer of governance that's talking about how political technology is. The technological is political, and is DPI going to help us blow that lid wider open in different communities so that these technologies that are introduced to serve citizens are actually negotiated as the best bet for delivering dividends on X and Y? And one of my favorite questions on DPI lately, I'm from Kenya, and is the question of M-Pesa that was the poster child of development 20 years ago. Is it a DPI, given that it's evolved over the years to serve multiple functions? It was not originally interoperable, but M-Pesa now can, you can do from M-Pesa to another service provider, you can do bank to M-Pesa and so on. Is it or is it not a DPI? There's this need to go from the familiar to the unfamiliar in answering those questions so that we're also not creating the idea that Africa is always starting from scratch. So I think there's a very valid concern there that we should sit with a lot more to make sure that even if we don't have a universal definition of DPI, the good work that has been done across the board on the continent is not considered null and void because there's a new terminology in town.
Excellent. Okay. So it's basically New terminology creates new anxiety, but the problems have always been there. And we have to address them at a fundamental level. Operator, please put the Slido in the central screen so that everybody sees. So please join the conversation. You have the ability to ask questions and vote on the questions. I want to go back to Robert. Robert, as an end result, it seems that we can agree on a definition of what DPIs are, but perhaps the bigger challenge is the pathway to getting there. When we look at the stories of all historical DPIs, they never followed the same path. Are there any common ingredients for how they evolve that we can understand, share, and say, while the paths are different, here are some key steps that have taken place that led to success?
Yeah, and actually, as I answer that question, if I may just address one sort of piece that is around this, and actually, may I address one of the questions
that's
here?
the question. I would just ask that question.
So, we're not talking just about old wine in new bottles here.
Right.
Because if we just break it down to the most fundamental element, the COVID pandemic shone a lot of light on the way countries are putting together their digital infrastructures. And every country is working on its own digital infrastructure in one way or another, obviously. The question is, we start to see certain countries that have found a kind of combination of layers of interoperability, and this is to the point of the question here on Slido. Interoperability is fundamental to our notion of digital public infrastructure. And when we use this term, it's taking those kinds of technologies like digital identity and data exchanges and that sort of thing, and kind of putting them into a package and signaling that this has worked really well for certain countries. And the interoperability as the governance, as the idea of communities, of being able to build on top of the infrastructure, that's really what makes the digital public infrastructure phrase different. And that's why we see potential to accelerate understanding about how to do this by taking lessons from different parts of the world and introducing them elsewhere. Now you mentioned, or you asked about the fundamental steps, and you know, there's a number of elements. I've already spoken about some. Digital ID is always thrown around as one of the kind of core ingredients. Last year, we put together a kind of a playbook on digital public infrastructure that walks through 6 steps on how to determine what might be right for your context. The answer is really, there's no magic bullet for any one place. It does have to be very carefully contextualized. There's not a cut and paste here that is possible, because a lot of people talk about Estonia, India, etc., that have shown good results with this approach, but it's not a matter of just cutting and pasting. What we're trying to do is take the inspiration from this and say you need to walk through a diagnostic of where you are, you need to think carefully about what you're trying to achieve, including how to bring citizens closer to government and services and so on and so forth. And that is, every country will have a different path, for sure. But we do know that there are elements that can be exchanged and reused often between countries as well. And that's the exciting part about accelerating this, so that we don't reinvent the wheel every single time.
I agree with that perspective, but it doesn't answer the fundamental question, is that what enabling environment do you put in place? Maybe Kanwal, you can step in and enrich that. What enabling environment do you put in place that leads to this magic of something emerging? Because if you design it centrally, then we're talking about point solution, which we agree this is not what DPIs are. So Kanwal, how do you make this magic come?
Thank you, Joseph. If we were to look at examples, I tend to think in terms of examples. We saw some very impressive numbers from India today. The cost of KYC went from $12 to like 5 cents or something. Now, when you talk about enabling environment, in my mind, and this is my personal opinion, not organizational, I think taking ownership and building long-term strategic capacity is key. Because what people often forget about mentioning in the India story is now India is taken as an exemplar for DPIs, which it is, both in terms of sheer volume and numbers. But the story really started in 1960, I believe, plus or minus a couple of years, when India decided that they need to invest in education and start producing the world's best engineers. And the IIT Act was passed. And 40 years of investments in education and building local capacity intersected the opportune moment in the year 2000 when the Y2K bug was going all around. And then it started paying dividends. So I think this is what is most exciting at the current juncture. If you look at currently the situation in Africa, the youngest continent.
Yes.
I mean, there are many, many reasons to be hopeful. I don't see any reason why we cannot have a similar environment in Africa where governments, private sector, and people take ownership of their digital transformation and say, we will build it. We will build the capacity necessary to do it. We will generate the political will necessary to do it. And we are going to go after inefficiency wherever we find it. And we have seen some examples of that. In fact, every time I come to ID for Africa, I walk away so inspired from my friend Emily's presentation from the Philippines, when they said, Philsys on a boat, Philsys on wheels, Philsys at mobile centers. That really highlighted the inclusion. But what was not mentioned was Philippines did that in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, at that time with lockdowns going everywhere, it was such an inspiring story to take and register, 86 million something number of people in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah.
If we look at Ethiopia, a very small team of engineers downloaded a software from the open source domain and deployed it on their own without talking to anyone. And that's an example of the capacity building which DPI, the desire to build DPIs can engender. If we look at how innovation is unleashed, the number of use cases, none of us is smart enough smarter than all of us. We cannot imagine all the use cases. Somebody else has to imagine that. But for somebody else to imagine that and try it out, the DPI has to be accessible. The DPI has to be built in a way that allows them innovation. So I think the three key pieces, in my opinion, for an ideal environment for DPIs are political will, taking ownership, and building the right capacity. And along with that, bringing people along. Because if it's coming from the people, for the people, it has a good chance to work.
I want to come back to this question to both of you, to Robert and yourself, by trying to define we talked about the ecosystem, but we want to talk about the role of the different actors in the ecosystem. So give this some thinking while I engage with Nanjira. Nanjira, critics are basically saying, at this stage in time, we should be careful not to basically stamp out or kill the baby before it's born, because we could be regulating something we do not understand yet. Create a sandbox or do something, but allow an ecosystem to emerge while you still continue to look at, see where the regulation is required. Now, does that cause you concern because that feels like the Wild West and everybody can do whatever you want? What would concern you about saying we need to regulate DPIs now?
I'd be surprised anyone wants to. I've heard that with AI, so it's interesting that it's coming up with DPI. But let me situate this in what I reckon many Africans will want. Will these IDs that we're getting from our requisite governments enable us to travel? Or will we still now need to get a passport and then an African Union passport? What will ease movement? These are the questions that I think are concerning people on a continent who want to interact with one another. So if DPI is going to do it, where are the dividends to deliver on that? Now, the African Union Digital ID Interoperability Framework is very interesting because it recognizes that every country will go about it its own way. But the idea to work towards is that these ID systems can recognize. If I am recognized as Nigeria in Kenya and I get to South Africa and I present this document, it should be recognized that it's been issued by an authority in Kenya that is recognized by the authorities in South Africa and so on. These are the things at the core I feel like are concerning folks who want to figure out all these new technologies, all these new terminologies. the questions that we're sitting, a continent that still is not able to move amongst ourselves freely. That is the bigger concern for somebody who's trying to think about whether the digital ID, whether it's regulated, sandboxed, power-formed, brought in from abroad, above and beyond, is going to make it possible. And those are the questions that I hope going forward we can situate when we talk about the technological aspects, how they're solving for X in this way. All the great presentations we've heard today, can those countries say they would come together and test traveling with an ID that has been issued, all these digital IDs, right?
Exactly. Okay, great. Robert and then Kanwal, I want to get your perspective on who do you consider are the stakeholders in the DPI ecosystem in a country, and what role do you think they should be playing? So we'll start with Robert.
Sure. Well, it's absolutely a multi-sectoral endeavor by nature, multi-stakeholder. Obviously, government plays a significant role in leading where this needs to go, setting the rules of the game. But civil society has to be at the table, private sector has to be at the table, ministries within government have to be at the table. That's a crucial one, because when you talked before about what are the ingredients for successful DPI, having strong leadership within a government is important, because so many of the entities are fragmented oftentimes. And so the roles that they play, you need to have, and this is one of the kind of elements of success that we distill among the different country examples we see, having a mechanism for participation, a mechanism for consultation, mechanisms that people can express from these different sectors and different stakeholders, what they're looking for, what their aspirations are. Private sector has a particular role in being able to both innovate on top, as we've spoken, but also can participate in the financing. There was a question in here, what roles do development partners play? And there's an important role for who, I think the question was, who pays for it, right?
Exactly.
Obviously national budgets can pay for this, IFIs are a piece of the picture, sometimes development partner grant financing. There's many different answers to that question, but it basically is a multi-stakeholder endeavor. By definition.
I understand, but I do not imagine, Kanwal, that while it's multi-stakeholder, that it's a democratic multi-stakeholder. Not everybody can be at the same level. Different people play different roles. So how do you see the different stakeholders' roles?
Well, the first thing, Joseph, we have to consider is, why do we do anything? There has to be a value proposition for each of the stakeholders.
For each stakeholder, yes.
So if we look at governments, they may be interested in building DPIs because they want more efficient governance. They want to find out who people are, or they want to find out how much money is flowing in the economy. They may want better transparency, better accountability. So those are the reasons why a government might be interested. At the same time, if the government is the force, the private sector has to be the force multiplier. And that's where the strong value proposition needs to come. So for example, in the case of a low-cost identity verification, how many private sector use cases are now enabled which could not be economically viable before? And we heard examples like proof of life, which you can give in the comfort of your home, or the getting of a SIM, or getting a cash in, cash out, as we saw in the case of India, where a postal worker can do it in a village at somebody's home who may not be able to leave their home. So DPIs enable a lot of private sector value propositions, which is why the private sector will be the force multiplier for DPIs. And I think that also opens up a new financing mechanism, because if it's in everybody's interest, then the governments can find better ways to engage with the private sector.
Right.
And most importantly, at the end of all this supply side thinking, needs to be the value proposition for people. Why do I care? Am I saving time? Do I not have to go to a center which is 10 kilometers away and end up paying some amount of money to do that? Am I saving money? Do I not have to pay the fee which I am used to paying for so long? And I think DPIs have to be imagined in a way such that there's a viable value proposition for each of the stakeholders. And last but not least, I do want to mention civil society, because civil society has an important role to play to force a rethink of whatever is being proposed, to make sure that it is built in a way that represents the interests of the people. So this is why when we look at the multi-stakeholder initiative, as Robert brought up, this is a multi-stakeholder effort. Everybody has to be at the table, but we also must recognize what are the value propositions for the stakeholders at the table, and do they make sense from their perspective?
Right. Excellent. Nanjira, do you see another ecosystem that resembles this, that we can learn from it on sort of the recent history? Can you imagine any ecosystem like this?
I think of the internet governance ecosystem.
Internet governance.
I think it's the most diffused tech governance ecosystem, and that has tried as much as possible to iterate on the multi-stakeholder involvement of actors. I say that too because internet and energy that has been brought up and is the most popular question remain core infrastructural dependencies for DPI. And so we cannot remove the conversation. There have been some actors who've assumed that DPI assumes some of these things as a given. These are still issues that we are trying to contend with on the continent. So when we talk about DPI, it hopefully incorporates the enabling infrastructure that we're still, including the roads and railways that we use as an analogy, by the way,
right,
as part of what we're saying to journey towards DPI. I think there's an interesting aspect or question that emerges. Can DPI enable leapfrogging, which has been a thing we've heard in different technology iterations? What can it enable that previous iterations of, say, analog or digital 1.0 have not managed to offer? We talk about, for example, I think up to 600 million Africans who still don't have legal identity, 400 million Africans who do not have access to financial services. Does this new concept help turbocharge or accelerate what other iterations or other ways of trying to get people served to happen? When we situate those questions as the North Stars or the South Stars, whatever we want to call as the right term, we then have a crisper understanding of what do we learn from what is working, and more importantly, what is not working in how we do technology policy, technology governance and advancement and investments.
One of the questions that came out, and then I'll ask anybody on the panel, it's basically saying, is it time to establish an international standard for, to sort of define the DPI maybe governance or the DPI structure? What is the role of an international standard in the building of DPIs? That's one of the questions that we have. So Robert, if you want to take a crack at it.
Yep, sure. Well, we actually are working on, I'm not sure I'd call it a standard, but we're actually working on a framework for digital public infrastructure safeguards, and that's supported with a number of different partners here as well. We do that together with the Technology Envoy of the United Nations, and the idea is that there are these separate sets of principles that exist and things like that, but we want to look more comprehensively at the level of principles, practices, procedures that are working, and to a certain extent, to Nanjira's point, the ones that aren't working, but to collect the ones that are working and put them forward for establishing better practice or good practice in this space. Now, it's not exactly a standard setting yet, but I do think that there is there's a path to get there. As I think we're not quite there yet, but I do think that we can look toward some of the kind of bottom line principles, and then on top of that, we may start looking towards standards as well. But that's, and then technically there are a number of discussions going on as well among ITU, among many others, about kind of technical standards. So if you're setting up different layers of technology, what should those technical standards look like? So there are those discussions, and I think that we should be, as a global community, working toward thinking, what does it make sense in that case?
Actually, Kanwal, I give you the option to answer the same question or take the second question on the leaderboard. I can read it to you. It basically says, can DPI lead to a dependency by countries in Africa, for example, on solutions from India, which is often held as a leading DPI country globally?
I think my answer is to the contrary of the assumption in the question. I think what is most exciting about Africa taking the lead on DPIs is innovating for its own problems. India may lead the DPIs from a volume perspective. But as we saw in the case of Brazil and the PIX payment system, that is completely different from how India does it. And it has more wider adoption and more wider usage as a percent of the population. And as we look at the local context, and this is where, Joseph, I wanted to tie in with your standards question as well.
Yes.
It is very tempting to make standards before they are necessary, but the underlying assumption is that we kind of understand that these standards will work everywhere, which is not true, I think. As we look at the needs of Africa, the context of Africa, the environment available, the use cases that are likely going to be high volume use cases, I think Africa can take a lead in setting those standards on how do you make DPIs more inclusive, more useful in resource-constrained environments. Like when we think about technology, we can say, okay, we are going to do some fancy gizmo device which will cost you some amount of dollars and requires 3 other gizmos to be able to read it. The point is, do I see that viable in a village where electrification may not have come yet?
Yes.
So the real challenge for the technologists is to first understand the environment that they are designing for, then understand the use case that this DPI is intended to solve the problem for, and then determine, is it really useful to people? Because we can come up with, in a related conversation, a very complicated solution was proposed on how does someone display a credential. And in that room, somebody says, but hold on, I could just take it out of my pocket and show it. Isn't that as effective?
Yes.
And I said, well, at the end of the day, you are doing a facial one-to-one match, and we have been doing it for 100 years now.
Yes, exactly.
So absolutely.
Exactly. Okay, I like that. Actually, Nanjira, do you like to answer this very popular question, which talks about the fact that Africa's energy infrastructure is unreliable? Are we basically trying to solve a problem that is secondary when we should be focusing on letting countries get their energy infrastructure?
We are in a situation on the continent that I like to use the analogy, we have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time.
At the same time.
And this question comes up a lot with artificial intelligence as well, because how are you going to have power for your home, or are you going to be running compute? Because the two, at this point, capacity is not matching. And I think this ties a lot to a question that has also come up with bureaucratic hurdles. At the core of what we are trying to do with any of these technologies, whether it's DPI in whatever we understand it today, or what it could evolve to become, is how are these technologies making these processes easier for us? If we can hack bureaucracy, I think 50% of Africa's problems could be solved. The question there ties to capacity and political will, which I know is a thorny topic, but that's at the core of it. These technologies will only work if they're in the hands of people who want them to work. That's just really the truth. Solving for energy poverty in Africa is down to whether we will let all the knowledge we have, because the problem has not been a knowledge problem, it's been an implementation problem, to work. Yes. And now we're not just trying to get energy to the last mile, we must get the internet to the last mile, we must get financial services, all the things we're saying are required in the present day to exist in this society. And the risk of not figuring out how to minimize bureaucratic hurdles is we end up with such exclusions and such divides that the person who has not been connected today is sitting at the intersection of so many inequalities that we might need to cost what it means to bring them on board if we have already left them this far behind. So the kind of thinking, and this goes to development partners as well as our governments, is when you're talking about DPI today, you cannot leave energy behind, you cannot leave internet access behind, you can't even leave education behind. Yes. That's just the situation on the continent, so we must situate all our technology excitement around these realities. That is the only way we're going to make technology policy work for Africa.
You're actually leading us into an issue here. It's not an isolated point discussion. It has to be holistic. And speaking of holistic, I like the second question. Robert, I hope you can take that. Basically, Yodahezi Michael's saying DPI requires a whole of government thinking. And so coordination among many executive bodies for its success, and you know how challenging that is. And so the question is, how do you get there? How do you establish whole of government thinking and action?
Yes. The answer to that question, by the way, is just flat yes. Lack of high-level commitment will hamper the success. But we have seen very successful examples, whether it be in places like Botswana or others that have like office of the president level led committees that oversee the whole sort of digital transformation effort. And that's where a lot of the things that we as UNDP do, and other partners as well, when we engage with countries, we try to think about the digital transformation journey as far upstream as we possibly can. And that often starts with just a frank discussion and dialogue between government and other sectors on where are we right now and where do we want to go. And if that has the championship of the highest level of government, the chances of success are very high. If it doesn't, there are still things you can do as ministries of ICT or other kind of groups of ministries to build systems now that are within your control that are still interoperable and that are set up in the same principles and so on that we're talking about here. But ultimately, it really does require that whole of government leadership, and that's really whole of society leadership.
Tone from the top is going to be very, very critical. We're running out of time, but I want Kanwal to address an issue which was raised by somebody by the name of Jerome. The issue is, how do you address the challenge of procurement in a DPI context? I mean, you're not buying a solution, and when I look at India, they bypassed that issue. They did not really procure. They created an ecosystem and people contributed to it. So explain to us your vision about that.
Well, Joseph, procurement is one of those issues which I think is the biggest stumbling block that DPIs today face.
Exactly.
Because I was joking with somebody earlier in the conference that anybody can buy eggs from the market, like keeping hens and getting eggs forever is a different story.
It's exactly a beautiful, beautiful analogy.
And I think the whole mental model has to change. This whole idea of buying end-to-end solutions and then locking yourself into that solution space, this whole mindset has to change. Because the reason DPIs unlock so much value is that you don't even know what you need 5 years from now. So how can you procure that today, not knowing what you need 5 years from now?
Right.
That flexibility has to come. This is a mental shift where you say, okay, what are the things I can do for procurement which don't lock me in 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, and I can build whatever I want on it. I can attach whatever I want on it. I may have 20 departments to interconnect today. I may have 200 departments to interconnect tomorrow. How will I scale my systems across the board? So this whole procurement issue with governments, and let's be honest, procurement is not one of those straightforward things. There is money involved in procurements.
Exactly.
There are vested interests involved in procurements. And sometimes doing the more expensive thing may be very attractive, right? So it is a balance of those interests which will take some hurdle jumping to do. Right. I mean, in a world full of boats where airplanes won't have been invented, people can only imagine how fast they can go from point A to point B. But the moment you invent airplanes and you completely change the way of how you travel, new wonderful things are possible. So I think procurements is one of those issues that development partners, international financial institutions, funders have to come together and say, why is it that we are basically creating documents which something like ChatGPT can create, and we have been creating it for like 50 years. Yes. Why is it so hard now? Why can't we have templatized documents and be able to do it in 20 minutes? That's an open question. I still don't know why.
But by the way, there is a procurement workshop on Friday.
Yes, UNDP,
is holding, so please join that. Some of those questions will come up for sure.
But actually, Robert, can you point an example of a country that bootstrapped itself up and did procurements, and now we see functioning DPIs that are now back into the public sector and that they're in use? Can you give an example?
Bangladesh, I would say, yeah. Okay,
and so basically, even in the entire world, the question of DPI is still not an easy bootstrap. So for Africa to feel overwhelmed by it, I think it's natural, and we understand that.
But I do think, Joseph, if I can just add on that, What we're trying to do is see if we can avoid the bootstrapping with everybody, right? What we're trying to do is to say that countries have a choice. And when you're putting together your DPI layers or configuration, you have choices. You can build it yourself if you have the capacity. This is what India did, this is what Bangladesh did to a certain extent, and so on. But that's an option. You can purchase it from vendors. That has its pluses and minuses. Or you can leverage a digital public good that's a reusable open source architecture. That also has its pluses and minuses. But we're trying to say there are choices out there, and it doesn't have to be one or nothing. It really can be a mix of these things, and it can be very bespoke for what your circumstance is.
Yeah, I think as the development community, it behooves us to try to come up with sort of success models or things that we see as templates, because honestly, I myself do not see what are the magical conditions that are going to cause rain to happen. I cannot call rain. Similarly with DPI, I mean, it just emerges. So what are the magical things? We don't have time to discuss this, so this is something to table for future events, hopefully live casts and AGMs. Your insights are great. I want to go to Nanjira and then back to the two of you. I want you, closing thoughts. Basically, what gives you hope, what gives you concern?
What gives me concern, let me start there, is we risk with a new concept following the same old practices, the ossified ways of doing and thinking. And just as that conversation was happening, I was thinking about with DPI in Africa, what we do need is a country-by-country contextual diagnostic of where are you and where do you need to go. Right now, when you see the blanket narratives, you could imagine that everybody has to start from scratch. But there are countries here that have done great strides with constituent parts, and what they're dealing with will be last mile issues. How we talk about DPI there will be very different from how we'll talk about DPI generally, and that's going to be very important because again, Africa is not a country. So that's one part. But how it also ties to the idea of the aspirations as a continent, digital strategy aspirations, and Agenda 2063 gives us hope, I think, to say, how do we creatively challenge these countries to make it easier? I used a very primal example because I want to be able to travel with my ID to South Africa, to Tunisia, to anywhere else. Because if these systems are speaking to themselves the technological way we've heard, why is it at the political level? Yeah. I still now have to go look for an African Union passport. I still have to go get a passport. And all this is a burden. I always say Africans end up forever queuing because there's always another document, there's always another thing that we need. So if we get this right, and if we have the fundamental conversations, if we shape what this moment is offering us, we can actually bust the door wide open. Procurement has been a fun one to riff on in the recent years because it helps us understand bureaucracy and how to resolve that. And I'll lastly close by saying, especially because civil society has been brought up, we have to remember that it's not just about making civil society the folks who shout from the outside. We have not yet figured out in many of our conversations how we journey with them even at the iterative stage. Often you'll have the government-private sector deal-making and then an announcement is made and then we have to make noise and go to court. And that cycle is not helpful because it's not that people in civil society are predetermined to always be on the outside knocking in. If we actually want a whole-of-society approach, even how we constitute ideas to serve a country needs a different model from what we have today.
And this is why empowering every voice is important. We want to hear from civil society as we are talking about this issue, not after the fact. So thank you for that. Both of you gentlemen, you can decide what gives you hope or what gives you concern. So you can take one or the other. Not both? You want both? I give you both.
Well, you know, the most hopeful aspect that I see about DPIs is the almost phenomenal levels of collaboration that are possible. We have seen countries collaborate with each other when they're talking about DPI concepts. We have seen, like, you know, especially in the case of Philippines and Ethiopia, very close collaboration between the ID authorities, teaching each other. I mean, Philippines is a land of 7,000 islands, as Emily just told us, and Ethiopia is not 7,000 islands. Yes. But the amount of knowledge that was exchanged, the energy in the room, I've seen that in so many countries. So collaboration, ingenuity. We saw in the pandemic that when the need really arises, we as humanity can come together and do wonderful things. But why is it that the stress level has to be at the level of a global pandemic for us to do that? I think we need to lower the bar a little bit and start doing more of that. So those two things make me very hopeful. And just one concern that we have a risk. Every time there is signal, there is noise. And we have a risk of the noise drowning out the signal. We are evolving language in dangerous ways. What started off as a means of communication and clarifying things has almost becomes a mean of not saying anything. And that to me is a much bigger risk to DPI than many other things.
Understood. Robert.
Okay, quick one of each. I think some of the things that Nanjir was saying are also my concerns. My biggest concern by far is that we're rushing ahead with the technology to solve a challenge, and we're leaving people behind. We're measuring the wrong thing,
yes.
Right? What ultimately matters is how well people are served by the whole configuration of DPI. The hope is that we do see that happening in certain places, and there are kind of uncommon partnerships, to Kanwal's point, across the world. So we see Pakistan partnering with Malawi, we see Bangladesh partnering with Somalia, we see all sorts of really interesting global interactions and exchanges, because at the end of the day, countries are trying to solve similar problems and can bring similar inspiration to that.
Great. Unfortunately, we can go on, but we have no more time. We have to move on to the next section. But you guys set me up for the very next section, because the next segment will illustrate a collaboration between two different organizations in one country. In Uganda, we're going to hear a presentation about the collaboration between NERA and NITA. So while I thank the panelists on the stage, I'd like to ask the representatives of NERA and NITA from Uganda to come to the stage to deliver their joint presentation under the umbrella of collaboration. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Najira. Thank you. Kanwal, thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Thank you. Actually, they want a photo, official photo. Grace, hello, and Dr. Mukasi. Okay. So with us, this is going to be a presentation, in fact, and it's going to be given jointly by Grace Nanyanzi, who's the Manager, Information Systems, National Identification and Registration Authority, NERA, and she's the ID for Africa Deputy Ambassador of Uganda, as well as Dr. Hatwib Mugasa. He's the Executive Director of the National Information Technology Authority, NITA, Uganda. So, ladies and gentlemen, please guide us through the magic of how different organizations can collaborate to produce some sort of DPI. Please welcome the speakers.
Good afternoon. So I come from Uganda, as Dr. just said, and we have a big team. I would like to recognize my members of parliament and minister from Uganda. So Uganda collaboration is not starting with DPI. So collaboration started at the creation of the National Identification Register in 2014, when we started registering persons. And at the creation of NERA, which is the National Identification and Registration Authority, this was an effort of all government agencies that came together to define how registration of persons should be done. And some of you that know about Uganda NERA ID, we don't only do identification. I think we are one of the countries that collect the largest amount of data on a person. I know that's not what data protection and privacy encourages, but there is a reason to that. We wanted this to be done once so that there is reuse of information, because there was so much money being spent by different agencies collecting the same data. So our role is basically we create and maintain the National Identification Register, but it also covers civil registration. And NITA, which is the National Identification IT Authority, the National IT Authority, are mandated to promote cooperation, coordination, and rationalization among other users and providers of information technology in Uganda and the region. And in the effort to have digital transformation, in Uganda, the foundation is identification, digital ID. We might not have it at the level where we should be, but what we have now is a basis for most of for public service delivery and any other services in the private sector. And NITA provides the infrastructure that runs the ID. So in terms of DPI, I think we all know the definition. We don't have to talk about it. But we have several services that are developed by the authority and other government agencies, that the use cases and modules that we reuse. That will be covered by Dr. That area. So we have what we call UG Hub. UG Hub is an infrastructure that sits at NITA, but used by all different government agencies. So it's a platform government of Uganda uses to enable authentication and share of data among government agencies. And NIRA is key because all services, most of the services require identification of persons. So currently we have over 135 entities depend on NIRA for identification or for eKYC. And we have a connection through NITA because as government, there was a decision in order to secure the data. So data is accessed through private leased lines. And that infrastructure is provided by NITA through the National Backbone Infrastructure. However, we also allow for direct connections, but the UG Hub does not only provide for access and use of information and authentication. We have other services at the UG Hub. For example, we have notifications through the SMS. They've aggregated. They've aggregated to enable for notification through SMSs and the USSD. USSD is very popular in Africa because of lack of wide coverage of connectivity and lack of smart devices. So we have a big number of our people depend on the short code. So this NIRA has what we call a third-party interface. That third-party interface links to the UG Hub platform, but we also allow connection directly to the TPI for one reason, just in case there is an issue with the UG Hub, though it is built on high availability, but anything can happen. We don't want to cut communication because right now it's difficult to receive certain services without having a national ID. So we have to make sure that we are up and so that the telecommunications are able to register SIM cards and the banks are able to offer financial services, and the rest of the public sector able to offer services to the citizens. So, but National Identification Register does more, as I said before, does more than ID. So we also do citizenship, because whatever we do, the data is, as I said, is reusable. So it's used for voter registration. And so we have to determine citizens, so that, because the only citizens will appear on the voters register. But the data is also used for other services, like cleaning up of a national payroll and in other databases. So at this point, I would like to invite Dr. Twib, who is also a board member at NERA. That's why I say the government was deliberate to the creation of NERA. The board members, all whatever they do, contribute to NERA, and they have a big role in whatever decisions that are made at that governance level. You're welcome, Doctor.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Dr. Atik, for inviting us to showcase and demonstrate the collaboration that agencies can do to promote DPIs. I'll just go back to the slide that Grace had presented on that DPI. I will not answer what DPI is. And the previous panelists, I was hoping to ask a question, but my battery died. Joseph, if you could allow me to ask and answer myself, since I have the floor. What is DPI? And is Safaricom a DPI? M-Pesa, I apologize, M-Pesa, DPI. This is, and most of the questions, apart from the one from Energy, I've been asking that at NITA. There are so many, you're just right on the point. I wish I could, and probably this is online, I'll go through it and share it with a team back in Uganda. There's so many questions around DPI, but it's not what, it is when. I think the answer is when. When do we see M-Pesa as a DPI? In my view, I feel we are not there yet. And that led also to a decision that we took at NITA, where we had a payment service which I felt was not the right way to deploy, and we had to even roll back, and we're now looking at the wider picture in terms of DPI, the Unified Payment Interface, or the UPI, similar to what India is deploying. Another question that I was happy or that I'm happy to share is about how can we define a DPI? And in my view, when we are deploying services or collaborating with agencies in the deployment of digital public goods and digital public infrastructure, we are looking at protocols, or we refer to a DPI as a protocol, not a point solution, as Joseph had mentioned. We should look at the wider picture. What is our goal? What's our objective of the solution and its sovereignty? Do we have control? Do we have control of this service? Just like if we take the analogy of roads and bridges, is there one entity that can shut down the road and deny access to the public, or it's available and there's no entity that will ever, unless, I don't know to mention if government shuts down, that is not a possibility, but sovereignty protocol, that's how we define DPIs in Uganda, but we're open to other decisions. So in summary, I believe for the concept of Uganda, we're also looking at the governance framework, and we took three approaches. First is at the apex of the decision-making body of government, that's at the cabinet level, all the way from the president who chairs the cabinet he is the one who spearheaded the formation of the working group. So we have a cabinet technical subcommittee on ICT, which now encapsulates all aspects of the digital transformation agenda that the country is taking, and this is where now NIRA came in. But we also co-opt other agencies, the Uganda National Bureau of Standards, the Electoral Commission, as when the need comes or arises and when we need to engage them. However, the Minister of ICT and National Guidance is chairing the committee, and NITA is a permanent member of the committee. Then we also move to budget. I know when you touch the budget, people listen. So we changed the way we budget in Uganda. Previously, we used to budget per sector. The agricultural sector would sit down and budget what they require in their financial year. Then the ICT sector also would budget. We also used to have the defense, all the other sectors in government would budget in silos independently. But that was changed. Now we're budgeting per program. So there are programs, and the digital transformation program is one of them. So where there's any aspect of digital or ICT, that is now put into a committee for budget, and we budget for the whole country. That streamlined the way we deploy solutions, and it also removed duplication and unnecessary deployments. So deployments that really are the term, I forget the term that the finance people use, but there's a term that they use that I don't want to use here. The third aspect of the governance was now at the institutional level, and that's what Grace has ably explained, the reason why I'm also referred to as a board member. So it was instituted within the Act of NIRA that the executive director of NITA, all a representative from the National IT Authority, shall be a member of board of the National ID Authority. This is because the NIRA, the National ID Authority, is the fundamental or the single source of truth, or must be the single source of truth for information. And here we're going digital. If we truly have to be digital, we must show it even at the institutional level. And that's what we have implemented within our governance structure. So moving on to UG Hub, this is one of the products that we deployed in government. Just a quick summary on UG Hub. We currently now have about 1.5 million interactions online. That means that we have reduced the number of face-to-face interactions per month by 1.5 million citizens. All these interactions are online. We have gone KYC digital or eKYC 100% with banks. So that means all banks now do eKYC in a click of a second, a process that will take about 2 weeks. There are so many statistics that I would want to share, but this is not just only for government. We have also extended it to the private sector. As you've seen, all the commercial banks are connected, and it is at no cost. We don't charge. It depends on the kind of data that you are receiving. There's also a governance framework that governs the way data is shared. It has to be with purpose. It has to be secure. It has to be for the reason that you are or that you need to operate your business as an entity or a private party. We are extending that connectivity to other sectors of government. The tourist sector would like to also connect to the information. We hold the largest information or data source, or the national database for the government of Uganda. So as we are securing this information, we also allow other entities to access that information for the purposes of socio-economic development of Uganda. NERA is our key stakeholder, and it's one of our big data data integrators, or the ones who enable the sharing of data through the UG Hub. Now we have gone a step ahead. We're saying we have brought this information in a central point. It's definitely, it has redundancy, and we provide all facilities for high availability and reliability and security. But now, what can we do more? And here we are going now e-signature. That enables us to move into the next level of the DPIs or the DPGs. We deployed a solution termed as UG Pass. It's a digital authentication and e-signature platform. It's a fully fledged, or in terms of the e-signature features, it's one of its kind in Africa. We have deployed it with a public key infrastructure, that is a DPI in this case, and this is a DPG that now allows you to securely sign, authenticate, and also provide e-stamps for the country. I think my time is almost up. I'll just rush through quickly. But we are expanding it even now to businesses. We will allow the integration of other services over the platform. We are also now extending it to the SAMBO certificate authorities. We shall provide some digital authentication and bulk signature for the platform. The future is having clarity on what data governance is, the data controls, data security, and understanding the concept of DPI. With those remarks, I would like to thank Joseph for this.
Thank you. I want to give you a very quick editorial analysis of why I was excited about UG Hub. I think UG Hub is exactly the example that we've been looking for about a DPI that has emerged. It's not a whole of government approach where a committee sat down and they ended up building it together. Building DPIs by committee will fail. That's not going to work. What's going to happen, UG Hub was built by one entity for use by all, and in order to ensure that, there was a governance mechanism and a finance mechanism put in place. So this is how we could build DPIs, which is we look at the centers of excellence in any given entity in the government. You say, you're good with data security, you're good with data management, build this, and by the way, this is not just for you. You can't say, I own it, you can't say, this belongs to me. You have to be receiving budget, financing, plus governance. And what's interesting is that the cross governance that exists, you're sitting on their board, they are saying what they need. So you are not designing by committee, but nevertheless, you are sitting on each other's boards. Yes. So that cross-fertilization, I urge you to look at UG Hub as an example of how we can, this is just one pathway, how we can develop DPIs. Okay, so thank you for that. This is why we brought you in. Thank you, both of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, I mean, step by step, we need to get there. I love what I heard from this. Unfortunately, we do not have time. I'm going to ask the next and final panel, and this final panel is going to be quick. So I'm asking 6 people to be on stage, and 2 representing different aspects of the DPI spectrum in any given country, 2 per country. I'm going to ask Mouhamed Mahi C, the Director of Information Systems, Senegalese Agency for Universal Health Coverage, and ID for Africa Ambassador for Senegal. Mariam Abdoulaye Ba, Coordinator PMO, IT and Quality Division, Operational Monitoring Office, Emerging Senegal Plan. Bonjour. Mphatso SAMBO, Principal Secretary, the National Registration Bureau, and ID for Africa, Ambassador for Malawi. Paul KATEMA, he's the eGovernment Director, Ministry of Information. Thank you, my friend. Ministry of Information and Digitalization, and ID for Africa Deputy Ambassador of Malawi. Luke Mate, thank you. Director, Systems Development and Support, Smart Zambia Institute, and ID for Africa Deputy Ambassador of Zambia. And Spriano BANDA, Chief Systems Development Officer from the Ministry of Home Affairs and Internal Security, Zambia. Please look. So, obviously, thank you. Obviously, we do not have time to go over the details of everything. I want to pose one question for each country, and everybody's going to answer the same question. We want to understand your strategy for stimulating the emergence of digital public infrastructure in your country. Clearly, we've just established that you do not sit in a room as a committee and you say, digital public infrastructure is something you start from zero and you have the programmers all sitting together and building it and then they will come. That's not how it's happening. That's not how it's happening in your countries. Nevertheless, every one of your countries has DPIs organically emerging. So we want to understand your approach for how you foster the right environment for DPIs to emerge. I want to look at it from the perspective of an identity authority and a perspective of an ICT authority. And so each country will give that, and when we move on to the next country. Obviously, we only have half an hour for the total event. So we have 10 minutes per country. So we start with Senegal. If you want to speak in French, that's okay. The Anglophones, please put on your headphones.
Thank you.
So does everybody understand the question?
Merci beaucoup. Donc le Sénégal a effectivement une approche DPI orientée sur deux volets. La première problématique qu'on essaie de résoudre, c'est justement d'arriver à avoir une identité unique. À travers cette problématique qui a été présentée tout à l'heure par nos homologues tunisiens, la difficulté qu'on a d'avoir des systèmes d'information publics qui fonctionnent en silo et d'avoir les citoyens qui ont chacun une identité différente. Donc la première problématique, c'est de résoudre cette problématique d'identité en regroupant toutes les identités fonctionnelles à travers une super identité qui va être un trousseau, qui va gérer un trousseau d'identités fonctionnelles. La deuxième problématique, c'est d'arriver à travers tous ces systèmes d'information publics qui fonctionnent également à silo, à avoir une sorte de plateforme de partage de données. Plutôt que d'éviter que les systèmes d'information essaient de s'interconnecter entre elles, ce qu'on a décidé, c'est d'avoir une plateforme publique de partage de données. Et c'est cette plateforme publique de partage de données qui va gérer l'interfaçage avec chaque système d'information public. Et du coup, on règle la problématique de l'identité à travers un trousseau d'identités identifié par une super identité qui est fédératrice des identités sectorielles existantes, qui va se connecter maintenant à la plateforme de partage de données publiques et permettre maintenant aux citoyens, aux entreprises de bénéficier de cette infrastructure publique digitale. Donc c'est du point de vue conceptuel ce qu'on est en train aujourd'hui de mettre en œuvre au Sénégal.
Okay, the perspective from the infrastructure side.
Alors moi, je vais donner la perspective vue organe de régulation un peu transversale sur l'organisation de la mise en place de DPI. Dans ce cadre-là, il faut dire qu'il y a une intervention qui se fait en amont, pendant et après la mise en place du DPI. En amont, il y a tout le cadre légal, juridique et gouvernance à bien sécuriser pour que ce soit un facteur clé du succès. Il y a toute la partie mobilisation de ressources. Ça peut être des ressources humaines, ressources financières, ressources matérielles, pour éviter finalement d'avoir des projets qui avortent avant d'arriver à la fin des projets, pour pouvoir anticiper aussi sur les modifications qu'il peut y avoir dans l'environnement, pouvoir avoir une certaine adaptabilité qui va être aussi un facteur clé de succès. Assurer un haut portage, je pense que tous les confrères qui sont passés avant l'ont dit, que c'était un gros facteur clé de succès de pouvoir avoir un portage à haut niveau de ce type de projet-là. Pourquoi? Parce que les parties prenantes viennent un peu de partout, le gouvernement, le secteur privé, la société civile, etc. Donc avoir un portage et un leadership qui soit à haut niveau permet de pouvoir mobiliser toutes ces personnes-là tout le long du projet et même après, de manière à pouvoir s'adapter ensuite. Donc je pense que ça, c'est les gros points à régler, en tout cas en amont, pour pouvoir aller vers des DPI, identité numérique. Et ensuite, une fois que c'est mis en place, je pense qu'il y a toute la partie suivi-évaluation qu'on oublie peut-être parfois, mais qui est très importante, qui permet de donner de la visibilité en tout temps, qui permet de s'ajuster. Et l'idéal, ce serait de pouvoir arrimer ce modèle de suivi et évaluation à un processus de problem solving, de sorte à pouvoir s'ajuster et être sûr de ne pas sortir de sa trajectoire. Donc voilà ce que je peux dire.
Merci beaucoup. Before we go to Malawi, of course, you've chosen to show us a video, which we will play, no worries, because you chose to use some of your time. I want to give a perspective on why I've selected Senegal. How many of you know the concept of potluck? The potluck, when you're invited to a party, do you know potluck? You do know that. Actually, can somebody tell us en français, c'est quoi potluck? C'est quoi? Quand vous êtes invité à une fête, vous venez avec quelque chose pour contribuer à la fête. So, I don't know what it is in French. In English, it's potluck. What I liked about the Senegal is that they offered us another model. What they basically said, we have assets. Many different organizations in Senegal have their own assets. And therefore, we're not going to start from scratch. What we are going to do is we're going to ask everyone to bring what they have, and we're going to create a middleware federator that really becomes the super layer that federates among all the assets that are existing. Everyone is responsible to maintain their own asset, but everyone, once they go through this federating layer, can essentially be part of this ecosystem and benefit from their neighbors, from their sister organizations' assets. So here's another example, just like UG Hub, where UG Hub, one entity built it, everyone else used it, governance and finance was resolved. Here, it was a federation model where you took existing assets and you built around them a federation layer, and now this became basically, to me, a digital public infrastructure is infrastructure that can be used by everyone because you have the right governance structure. And this is what they're working on. This is why I liked that model. So thank you for that. Merci beaucoup pour le modèle de Sénégal. On va appeler ça, au lieu de dire potluck, on va dire le modèle sénégalais. S'il vous plaît.
Ce qui a justifié surtout ce choix, c'est qu'on ne veut pas sortir les gens de leur zone de confort. Parce qu'on se dit le meilleur moyen de faire accepter le changement, c'est que les gens ne ressentent pas le changement, justement. S'ils restent dans leur environnement, qu'ils restent toujours dans leur zone de confort, parce que pour nous, la transformation digitale, elle doit être transversale, mais elle doit être un peu transparente. Et ça ne doit pas susciter de choc ni de changements considérables qui peuvent freiner l'utilisation de ces services. Et l'autre avantage qu'on a, c'est qu'en partant de ça, c'est que chez nous au Sénégal, on a l'avantage que c'est justement les gens qu'on pensait qu'ils étaient exclus justement du digital, ce sont ces gens-là qu'on a priorisés à travers justement les programmes de protection sociale qui sont déjà digitalisés, à travers la couverture maladie universelle également, où le Sénégal a un vaste programme de prise en charge des vulnérables et des indigents, sachant que cette catégorie-là, qui d'habitude était tout le temps exclue justement des systèmes digitalisés, qu'on a intégré d'abord ces gens-là à travers le programme de protection sociale et les bourses de sécurité familiale, qu'on a intégré aussi les plus vulnérables à travers la santé et l'assurance maladie. Si eux, ils sont déjà embarqués à travers des systèmes d'information qui existent déjà, ça va être plus facile après d'intégrer le secteur formel qui est déjà habitué à utiliser ces technologies de l'information et de la communication.
Excellent. So the Senegalese model is the one that we can also consider as an alternative for collaboration, for how organizations can work together. I like it. I think it has merit. And it also addresses what Nanjira said, that we don't want to create anxiety for people because we're creating a new term. We don't even need to call it DPI. It's called togetherness. Let's work together. So we change the terminology. The change in terminology is not needed. So I thank Senegal for sharing their experience. I like to go to Malawi. Unfortunately, we really don't have much time. So I will go to Malawi. Malawi opted to use 3 minutes of their time to show us a very, very interesting video. So operator, under the guidance of Ambassador Sambo, please, when you're ready, let us know.
Yes, we can go ahead to launch the video. Thank you.
Malawi's journey towards digital ID began with paper-based IDs. Until 2017, most of Malawi's adult population was never identified by any legally recognized document. In 2017, the government of Malawi, through the National Registration Bureau, NRB, launched the National Registration and Identification System, NRIS project, to address problems associated with the lack of universal and compulsory registration for legal identity. The NRIS program was implemented through a UNDP-administered basket fund in partnership with the NRB and donors. The program was designed to establish a permanent and continuous national registration and identification system in Malawi. It utilized biometrically secure smart cards to register citizens aged 16 and above. Over 10.5 million Malawians now own a national ID. The national ID card includes a unique identification number, QR code, chip, and machine-readable zone. The national ID is used as legal identity and proof of citizenship and has several use cases, such as financial inclusion, e-verification, e-KYC, digital payment, social services, and e-government services. It is also aligned with Sustainable Development Goal SDG 16, Target 9. The national ID has already generated transformative benefits and improvements in service delivery, governance, economic, and social inclusion. The future of digital ID holds significant potential for transforming the way Malawians authenticate and verify identities online. A credible digital ID ecosystem has been developed in Malawi and is now being transitioned to a fully digital ID, with citizens at the center having full control of their data in line with data privacy and security elements. This achievement puts Malawi on track to be the first African country to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 16, Target 9. The Malawi National ID is not just a card. It's the foundation block for digital public infrastructure and a symbol of progress towards a more inclusive and prosperous future for all Malawians.
Thank you very much. We wanted to firstly show our journey on the implementation of the digital public infrastructure in Malawi. And our strategy has been to work with all stakeholders. We are talking of the parliament by having the laws that govern the setting up of the digital public infrastructure, the digital ID, as well as the data protection and other specific laws. We also have got the regulations that are governing the implementation of the digital public infrastructure. So let me hand over to my colleague to continue from there.
Yes, explain. Yes, please.
Thank you. To start with, Malawi, in its approach to implement the DPI, looked at what is agreeable in terms of the components of DPI. So, Malawi has demonstrated we have had a vibrant national ID since around 2016, 2017. And it was a matter of looking at the gaps in terms of what is required or what is globally acceptable as the components of DPI. So we noticed that what we were lacking was the data exchange platforms, as well as unified payment systems. So as of last year, we embarked on implementing these two critical platforms. Our approach hasn't been very much different from what our colleagues in Uganda have done. In fact, Malawi has had a number of visits to Uganda to appreciate how it's been implementing, and this is something that we have adopted. So we are implementing an enterprise service bus, which we call Bomalatu in Malawi. What we're looking at is to facilitate the integration of various services to the DPIs, which in this case, the main one being identification. So, so far, we have done the pilot phase. We had an ambitious plan to connect 11 institutions as part of the pilot. We have managed to do 7, and lucky enough, with the support from World Bank, we are almost going into a second phase of a Digital Malawi project, where now we look at extending a number of MDAs that will be participating in this enterprise service bus. On the other hand, through the financial regulator, which is on the other hand, the regulator for the financial services is implementing the e-payment gateway. So what we're looking at is once we have the e-payment gateway and we have the enterprise service bus plus the ID system, which we have already seen, then we have these main components of a DPI. Of course, the journey might not necessarily stop there. We are also looking at enhancing the digital ID systems. Currently, we have the card with a chip, but we believe it's also time to start extending it to a digital ID. We have a similar challenge like most of the African countries, that probably a digital ID might not be accessible to everyone, but we thought we can start with implementing more like parallel solutions where a different type of people as to using the card ID, and those that have got access to smart devices can be adopting the digital ID. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to give an editorial comment. Thank you both for that. What I saw in Malawi, and Malawi would be a good sort of model for countries, actually for countries who do not have as much legacy. Malawi, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, you had no identity system. You were one of the last countries in Africa not to have a digital identity or even a national population register. And so, in a way, they are able to come in and focus on some of the core components necessary. A data exchange, this was a data exchange platform, very critical because identity data needs to be shared. Consent and identity data need to be shared across many organizations. So you build the right data exchange model. e-payment, the gateway to process, etc. So I think Malawi is a model. If you're a country that you do not have too much legacy, it's a good model to use. You can afford to start on a what we call the green field. So we can call Malawi the green field. I think your country is very green, right?
Of course it is.
Wonderful. So you can, if you want to react, just 1 minute.
Okay, thank you very much. So as you can see, the setup of our DPI has been from the introduction of the digital identity, which is the foundation of the DPI. And we recognize that from this digital identity, the legal identity, which is acceptable as a single source of truth, can be the foundation and the center of enabling the other sectors. For example, the financial sector, could it be the agricultural sector or education sector, using the identity as the powerful identification or the only identification solution for every Malawian. And this has also helped to ensure that the existing digital payment solution and the future of the data sharing infrastructure, the BOMALATU, similar to the UG Hub of Uganda, should be realized as a solution to the digitalization process through the DPIs we have.
It's all about data. So if we focus on creating infrastructure to support data securely and basically allow the sharing of data, then I think this is a good starting point for building DPIs. Let's go, last but not least, I'm anxious to hear the Zambia story.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Doug, for giving us an opportunity as Zambia to share the DPI implementation in Zambia. So we're not going to belabor the point of defining what DPI is all about because previous speakers have ably defined that. However, in Zambia, I can say that we are implementing DPI by looking at the 3 pillars of DPI. The first one is the identity system, which is the foundation of all what we are doing in this era. The second one is the issue of payment gateway. In this case, we are trying to create a platform that is going to facilitate e-services deployment. And in Zambia, we are implementing the government saves bus. The third pillar that we are looking at is data sharing. So data sharing in the sense that we need to ensure that this information or this data that is being generated is properly shared. And how do we share that? We need to create systems or platforms that are going to help us to know our customers very well. So these are the 3 pillars that we are looking at. And my colleague is going to look at the other 2. But when we're looking at the identification, the status of the identification system in Zambia, that it has gone, I think, now in 3 phases from the time we started the process. The first phase looked at the issue of procurement of the system, and this was based on the automatic fingerprint or code EFIS system. So the second phase looks at now upgrading this EFIS to EBIS, which I think now in the third phase now we are looking at now the deployment and also the implementation or enrollment. And currently, we are now at 15% of our targeted population targeted the enrollment that we need to do, which is the 10 million target. However, only 15% has been enrolled in our identity system, which is the National Integrated Registration System. So I'll hand over to my colleague maybe to handle the last 2 parts, which is the eKYC and also the payments gateway.
All right, thank you. So I think as Spriano has stated there, we have the identity solution. However, I think in terms of our strategy, we are looking at resolving a problem. Our strategy basically at this point is we realize that the government, the digitization of services in the country has actually overtaken the rate at which our identity project is being implemented at. And arising from that, we are trying to solve that question to say, do we stop the digitization of services so that the digital identity project can then catch up? Or do we leverage on existing data sets that we have? In this case, using DPI principles, we are trying to leverage on the existing asset or the data resources that exist. We do realize that there are other functional registers within our ecosystem which are vetted and have got capable trust built in them. And arising from that, government is in this case looking at implementing an eKYC platform which should then enable the ecosystem in terms of identity proofing or identity verification, and which is what we are doing right now. And looking at that solution, you realize that it's something which, because of the way it has come up, we are doing it in a cautious approach, so to say. We just completed our POC phase. We are now moving into the full pilot, and we have picked a use case in this case, and in this use case, we are looking at health. Interesting case, you may ask, that how do you choose health? The idea was we went with health because there's already a project in Zambia where we are automating the electronic health records. And this project is called the Smart Care Project. And arising from that, we are leveraging on the same implementation to add on the component of identity management, thereby reducing the cost of implementation of this solution. With identity management, they do not need to worry about identity solution being locked into their solution. Instead, we are looking at having a common use case, a common platform, a common eKYC solution, which can then be used by various use cases. Only that for the start, we are going with a health use case. Earlier on, I think he mentioned the second use case of the digital payments. I think right now the forerunners of our DPI implementation in Zambia is the government. And mostly we are looking at enabling service provision. And so we do have various social protection programs, those others which are even economic in nature, like supporting the farmers. We have one which is under the Ministry of Community, which gives grants to social protection programs such as welfare. And now we also have others under the disaster management component. You find that all these implementations are being run by individual agencies or independent agencies of government. And each one of them may have their own unique solution, but with what we are trying to achieve right now, or what we are pushing for, is to ensure that we have those common services or common platforms be shared, such as the gateway for payments, for instance. If we are able to get that to work together so that the various entities in our ecosystem, the various players, those still remaining in charge of their registers, they can then use those common rails for them to reach the identified beneficiaries. So those are some of the strategies or use cases that we are really trying to deal with at this point in time.
I'll provide an editorial on what you're doing, because I think you're being modest. I think what I liked about Zambia was the idea that first focus on your digitalization mission. You need to solve a problem, you need to solve a use case. But while you're doing the digitalization, ask yourself the question, are there exhausts or outputs that we could actually make into DPI and make them available for even more support for more applications? Absolutely. So don't start with DPI. DPI is not the starting point. The starting point is digitalization, because governments have to become digital, because citizens are expecting to receive their services through digital. Their approach is we start with digitalizing what we need, and then along the way, we find the elements that are common, reusable, and we classify them as DPI, and we build governance structure on top of them. So I would say, if I take the liberty, I will label you as digitalization first, DPI second. If I have to label Senegal, I would say federation of existing assets through middleware. And then if I had to label Malawi, I would say, yes, it's good sometimes to start from the green field so you can look at your needs in your country without having the legacy. I hope you have seen today two things: that Africa has talent, and that Africa has DPI, and that Africa has choice. They are not all doing exactly the same thing, nor are they following the same formula. This is why I emphasize the question of choice. This is why we respect that diversity, and we need to basically be on the lookout and listening to how it is. I learned a lot from talking to the African authorities on how they are approaching DPI, even when they were not calling it DPI. In reality, there is a lot for us all to learn when we open our minds and listen to how different people are solving different problems. I hope today was a fruitful day for you, and that we were able to satisfy your expectations by giving you an overview of the state of development of digital identity in Africa. I will thank you for staying with us till this late hour. I think it was a long day, but I hope it's rewarding. So please join me in thanking our panel, and I promise you tomorrow will be even a very, very fascinating day with the technology symposium, 2 fascinating sessions back to back, and then the NIST symposium. The NIST symposium, you will never see it anywhere else. You have to be here. And then at 16:15, which means 4:15, we are going to unveil what you've all been wondering, what you've all been asking: where is the AGM going to be in 2025? And then, of course, we're going to end the day with the interoperability question of data and systems, which is becoming a very, very hot topic. Before we close, I remind you to leave the headsets. Please leave the headsets. They need to be recharged, and they need to be collected and cleaned and recharged. So thank you, and I will also ask the members of parliament to stay. We will have a family photo with members of parliament. Any other announcements I need to make? Okay. Thank you very much.
Messieurs les députés, Messieurs les honorables membres du Parlement des pays africains, s'il vous plaît, le docteur Atik souhaite vous avoir sur scène. Honorable members of parliament, heads of Senate, different countries of Africa. I know Mali is present, I know Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, amongst other countries. Could we have you all on stage? Please. Les honorables membres du Parliament. Dear ambassadors, dear ID for Africa ambassadors, kindly usher on stage. Thank you, ma'am. Madame l'honorable, merci, s'il vous plaît. Sur scène. Monsieur l'honorable, thank you, Nigeria's representatives. Yes, they're coming on stage. We're going to get all those. Mali, thank you. Côte d'Ivoire, could we have all of you? Yes, thank you. Non. Est-ce qu'on peut avoir les ambassadeurs? Qui sont ceux et celles qui peuvent faciliter la prise de photo avec les téléphones aussi? Il y a des professionnels pour la prise de photos. Est-ce que nous avons sur scène tous les honorables membres de la Chambre haute ou basse? Ah, on avance. Okay, why don't you take it close to this?
Ah, d'accord.